Mount Erebus, named for the Greek god of darkness and son of chaos, is an ice-covered volcano that has towered over Antarctica's frozen seas since time immemorial. Its extreme isolation means very few have ever laid eyes on it. But what if you could witness this majestic natural wonder from the comfort of an airline seat, champagne in hand? This was precisely the experience Air New Zealand began offering its customers in January 1977, to make the last frontier accessible to all. It was an idea that would end in tragedy. The concept of commercial tourist flights to Antarctica was first floated by Air New Zealand in 1969. The original plan involved using DC-8 aircraft to ferry passengers from New Zealand to McMurdo Station, an American research base, and back. While this plan advanced considerably, it was eventually shelved due to the high cost of refueling at McMurdo and the DC-8's inability to complete the round trip without stopping. However, the idea never fully faded. It lay dormant until 1976, when Qantas, the Australian flag carrier, announced plans to begin non-stop sightseeing flights over Antarctica. By then, Air New Zealand had acquired a new fleet of long-range DC-10 trijets, capable of flying to McMurdo and back non-stop. This was no ordinary commercial flight. Sightseeing operations involve unique challenges pilots don't typically face. The goal isn't merely to transport passengers safely from point A to point B, but to entertain them. This often entails low-altitude flying for better views and visual navigation, manually flying by reference to landmarks, a practice rare in standard airline operations. Such flying requires maintaining visual meteorological conditions, VMC, rather than operating under instrument flight rules, IFR, through clouds. While manageable in a small plane over the Grand Canyon, doing so in a DC-10 over Antarctica was an entirely different proposition. In the 1970s, much of Antarctica's terrain was poorly charted, with mountain heights often inaccurate or unknown. Navigational aids were scarce. Air New Zealand's solution lay in the DC-10's Advanced Inertial Navigation System, INS. This system used gyroscopes to track the aircraft's movement in 3D space, calculating its position in real time. By pre-programming geographical coordinates into the INS, the autopilot could guide the aircraft along a precise route without external references, provided the initial coordinates were entered correctly. The INS was highly accurate for its time, drifting at most about a nautical mile per hour. With this technology, Air New Zealand planned a specific route. Departing Auckland, the flight would head south over New Zealand's South Island, past the Auckland and Balleny Islands, then southeast across Cape Adare to the stunning Cape Hallett. From there, it would turn south along the coast of Victoria Land towards Ross Island, home to Mount Erebus, McMurdo Station, and New Zealand's Scott Base. The aircraft would then turn over McMurdo Sound, a partially frozen stretch of water crucial to this story, pass a historic hut from explorer Robert Falcon Scott's expedition, and head back north past the McMurdo Dry Valleys before returning via Campbell Island and Christchurch. The entire journey was designed to take about 11 hours. On board, passengers enjoyed continuous meal service with complimentary champagne, while veteran Antarctic explorers provided live commentary. The flights were deliberately underbooked to allow people to move around and take photos, and pilots often invited passengers to the cockpit. The initial flights in 1977 received rave reviews. Encouraged, Air New Zealand secured approval for more flights in late 1977, for in November 1978, and another 4 in November 1979. This brings us to the flight of November 28, 1979, the last of the approved journeys, and rumored to be the final Antarctic flight due to rising fuel costs. The captain of Flight TE901 was a respected 45-year-old pilot with over 11,000 flight hours, though he had no prior experience flying to Antarctica. His first officer had over 7,900 hours. The crew also included a relief first officer and 2 flight engineers. Notably, only one of them had flown to Antarctica before. While Air New Zealand's own rules required pilots to have supervised experience in such regions before commanding a flight there, the Civil Aviation Division had waived this requirement at the airline's request. U.S. personnel at McMurdo were concerned about this lack of experience, as their own pilots required a full season of Antarctic flying before taking command. They viewed Air New Zealand's approach as risky, given the unique hazards of visual navigation in Antarctica. 19 days before the flight, the crew attended a route briefing. They were introduced to grid navigation procedures used south of 60 degrees latitude and given various documents, including military navigation charts for McMurdo, a rough map of the approximate route, and a list of coordinates to program into the INS. Crucially, they were not provided with detailed topographical maps showing the INS track in relation to the terrain. The briefing materials stated the minimum safe altitude in VMC was 16,000 feet until reaching McMurdo, after which a descent to 6,000 feet was permitted under radar guidance. However, some pilots later testified they were told they could descend to 1,500 feet with McMurdo's approval, a point management denied. The briefing failed to cover several critical areas: the basis for the minimum altitudes, the relevance of the military flight route, emergency landing procedures on the ice runway, and unique Antarctic visual phenomena like whiteout conditions. Furthermore, U.S. controllers at McMurdo were unaware of Air New Zealand's altitude policies and would likely not have approved a radar descent to 6,000 feet south of the station due to poor radar coverage. On November 28, 1979, the crew arrived at Auckland Airport. Their DC-10 was in perfect condition. The weather en route was good, with reports of clear conditions near Cape Hallett and broken to overcast clouds at 3,000 feet near McMurdo, with high visibility below. The flight carried 237 passengers and a commentator, famed mountaineer Peter Mulgrew, standing in for Sir Edmund Hillary. The crew manually programmed the INS coordinates for the flight. At 8:17 local time, Flight TE901 took off. The flight proceeded smoothly, following the INS track. As they approached Cape Hallett, the captain disengaged the autopilot's NAV mode briefly for a better view, then re-engaged it. As the flight continued south, the crew contacted Scott Base on Ross Island, broadcasting the conversation for passengers. Later, preparing for the sightseeing descent, the captain commented, "I think we'll start down a little early here," likely due to updated weather reports showing the cloud base had lowered to 2,000 feet. They contacted McMurdo Area Control, MAC Center, via HF radio for an update. MAC Center reported cloud at 2,000 feet with 40-mile visibility and scattered snow showers, but mentioned gaps in the clouds 75 to 100 miles northwest of the station. The captain remarked, "Doesn't look very promising, does it?" Then MAC Center made an offer. "Within a range of 40 miles of McMurdo, we have a radar that will, if you desire, we can let you down to 1,500 feet on radar vectors." The pilots accepted. The captain announced the radar-guided descent to the passengers. MAC Center then asked them to switch to VHF radio for clearer communication. However, when the first officer tried, there was no response. Mount Erebus was blocking the signal, a fact unknown to the crew. This situation raises a pivotal question. Did the pilots know where their programmed INS track was leading them? Unbeknownst to them, the final waypoint in the INS had been changed just 6 hours before departure, and they were never informed. To understand this, we must revisit the flight planning. For the initial 1977 flights, the navigation track's turnaround point was set at the coordinates for Williams Field, the ice runway. Later, when creating a permanent computer flight plan, the intent was to change this final waypoint to the McMurdo Non-Directional Beacon NDB for redundancy. However, according to the chief navigator's testimony, during data entry he mistakenly typed a longitude of 164 degrees 48 minutes east instead of 166 degrees 48 minutes east. This error shifted the final waypoint 25 miles west of Williams Field, out into the middle of McMurdo Sound. This incorrect track down the sound made logical sense. It kept the aircraft over flat ice and water, away from terrain, offering views of Mount Erebus to the east and Victoria Land to the west. It was used for 12 flights without issue, as pilots typically left the program track for visual sightseeing in good weather, so no one verified the endpoint's coordinates. Justice Peter Mahone, who later led a Royal Commission of Inquiry, suspected this McMurdo Sound route was intentional. A track to the actual McMurdo NDB would have passed directly over the 12,450-foot summit of Mount Erebus, illogical for sightseeing and potentially hazardous due to volcanic activity. Then, on a flight on November 14th, a captain noticed a 27 nautical mile discrepancy between his position and the INS track near the McMurdo Tacken, a military navigational aid. Believing the final waypoint was supposed to be in McMurdo Sound, he thought this was a flight plan error. After landing, he reported it, suggesting future crews be informed. The DC-10 line operations manager misunderstood this report. Knowing the NDB was being decommissioned, he assumed the request was to move the final waypoint from the NDB to the nearby Taken. Unaware of the long-standing error, he thought this was a minor 2-mile change. In reality, he moved the coordinates from the point in McMurdo Sound to the Taken's location, a 27-mile shift that now routed the track directly over Mount Erebus. This change was made at 2 a.m. on November 28 and incorporated into the coordinates given to Flight 901's crew, who entered them into the INS. No one told the crew about the change, as everyone thought it was insignificant. Mahone believed the airline had informally used the safer McMurdo Sound route but changed it back to the NDB coordinates, near the Taken, because aviation authorities were about to publish a chart showing the route, and the originally approved plan had listed the NDB. He suspected a cover-up of the failure to inform the crew. Regardless, the captain of Flight 901 likely believed the track would take him down McMurdo Sound. He had plotted the old coordinates on his own maps. The lack of INS drift earlier in the flight reinforced his confidence. He had no reason to suspect the track now led over Mount Erebus. Back on Flight 901, unable to establish VHF contact with McMurdo Tower due to Mount Erebus obstruction, the captain decided to descend visually through a gap in the clouds. He informed MAC Center, which approved a VMC descent, asking for altitude reports. The captain initiated a right orbit, descending to 10,000 feet, then later to 2,000 feet, planning to fly visually under the clouds. During the orbit, passenger photos show Beaufort Island visible to the west. If they were over McMurdo Sound as believed, the island should have been far to the east. But with no prior Antarctic experience and limited briefing materials, the crew likely misidentified it as a feature off Victoria Land. Commentator Peter Mulgrew, who might have recognized it, appears to have missed it. The captain's decision to descend below 16,000 feet north of McMurdo became controversial. The official company minimum, approved by regulators, was 16,000 feet in that sector. However, the Mahone inquiry found that nearly all previous Antarctic flights had descended lower, sometimes to 1,500 feet, and that management had tacitly approved this. Low flying was even mentioned in passenger accounts and a magazine article. Mahone believed the captain was operating within an accepted, though unofficial, practice. At around 1347, with the aircraft at 2,000 feet and in clear air below the clouds, the captain re-engaged the NAV mode to resume the program track, a decisive act showing he trusted it completely. He then descended further to 1,500 feet. The aircraft was now in a wide-out condition, a uniform white snow surface under a uniform white overcast sky. This eliminates contrast, shadows, and depth perception, making sloping terrain like Mount Erebus invisible. This phenomenon, common in Antarctica and a major hazard, had never been briefed to the crew. Believing they were over McMurdo Sound, the pilots saw distant land to their left and right, likely Cape Tennyson and Cape Bird framing Lewis Bay, north of Mount Erebus. They probably mistook these for the wider capes at the entrance to McMurdo Sound. As they continued, the captain grew concerned about not identifying landmarks. He asked about DME distance readings, but they were not receiving a signal. He then stated, "We're 26 miles north, we'll have to climb out of this." He ordered a right turn, with the first officer assuring him the area was clear. Seconds later, the aircraft crossed the north shore of Ross Island. The ground proximity warning system, GPWS, sounded, "Whoop whoop, pull up." The flight engineer called out altitudes from the radio altimeter, 500, 400. The captain calmly called for go-around power and pulled up. It was too late. At 1350, Flight TE901 struck the lower slopes of Mount Erebus at 1,500 feet, killing all 257 people on board. The initial investigation by the New Zealand Office of Air Accident Investigation, OAAI, led by Chief Inspector Ron Chippendale, concluded the probable cause was the captain's decision to descend to low level in poor visibility when uncertain of his position. However, The subsequent Royal Commission of Inquiry under Justice Peter Mahone reached a very different conclusion. Mahone found that the crew was certain of their position. They simply believed they were over McMurdo Sound due to the undisclosed change in the INS track. He placed primary blame on a catastrophic breakdown in communication within Air New Zealand, which led to the fatal track change without the crew's knowledge. He also criticized the airline's inadequate planning, briefing, and coordination with McMurdo authorities. Furthermore, Mahone's report made explosive allegations. He accused Air New Zealand management of a predetermined plan of deception and an orchestrated litany of lies to cover up administrative failures, including document destruction and misleading testimony. While these specific allegations were later set aside on a technicality by a judicial review, Mahone's report had a profound impact, shifting public understanding of the disaster. The enduring lessons of Flight TE901 highlight the critical need for rigorous planning, clear communication, and utmost respect for the unique dangers of operating in extreme environments like Antarctica. It stands as a stark reminder of how a chain of procedural failures and human error can lead to tragedy in one of the world's most unforgiving places.